The concept of teleology is one which, over the course of the late 19th and 20th centuries, came to fall heavily out of favor within the realms of academic sciences and Anglophone analytic philosophy. Telos is a term derived from the philosophy of ancient Greece and was particularly significant within the thinking of Aristotle. Telos is often translated as the word cause, though this rendition of the concept can be rather misleading, as we will see. Aristotle wrote of 4 distinct forms of telos, each being one of the underlying factors which gave shape to the entities which we encounter in the world. These were the material telos, the efficient telos, the formal telos, and the final telos. We can understand this conceptual framework by looking at the example of a statue. The material telos of the statue is the marble out of which the statue is made. The efficient telos consists of the actual chiseling, the physical work which goes into creating the statue. The formal telos consists of the formal elements which the statue's creator seeks to realize in the creation of the statue, the ideas, concepts, or aesthetic principles which guide the statue's creation. The final telos, then, is the purpose of the statue, the reason why it is created, what purpose it serves, or what its creation attempts to achieve. Within this form of thinking, causation and purpose are understood to be of a common essence. For the ancient Greek mind, purposiveness was seen as an inherent aspect of the natural world, a fundamental principle among the forces which give shape to the world. With the rise of reductionist materialism, beginning with the works of figures such as Galileo and René Descartes, teleology would come to be conceptually separated from causation. The material and efficient teloi would come to be understood as causal in a fundamental sense, and today it is common for the word causation to refer specifically to either the physical impacts of certain events upon others, that is, efficient teloi, or to the material constituency of an object or process, that is, what materials compose things, or material teloi. The term teleology then came to refer specifically to the formal telos and final telos. Within the paradigm of reductionist materialism, efficient and material teloi were regarded as fundamental to reality, while formal and final teloi came to be regarded as only relevant to the realm of human activity, or to the activity of God. The modern mind came to see that the world was primarily composed of mere matter, and that such matter, lacking agency or consciousness, was simply an inert kind of substance which was shaped entirely by efficient and material causation, unless the influence of human or divine intervention came into play. Materialism resulted in a bifurcation of teleology from causality, and this bifurcation mirrored the corresponding bifurcation of mind and matter. Thus, the standard paradigm of modern science gradually attempted to purge teleological thinking from scientific discourse. Science came to be regarded as an understanding of the world which reduced all apparent purposiveness of the natural world to the mechanical unfolding of processes which were ultimately blind, meaningless, and random. This trend of anti-teleology would become an entrenched dogma by the early 20th century. But this form of thought was far from universally accepted by either philosophers or scientists. One thinker who would radically diverge from this tendency of anti-teleological reductionism was the French paleontologist and cosmologist Teilhard De Chardin. Born 1881, Chardin was a man who was possessed by a passion for both natural science and religiosity. He was influenced very early in his scientific career by the works of Henri Bergson, particularly by Bergson's Creative Evolution, in which Bergson articulated an understanding of life, nature, and evolution which contrasted drastically with the mechanistic materialism which had come to dominate the discourse of established scientific institutions. In 1911, at the age of 30, Chardin was officially ordained as a priest of the Jesuit order. The First World War would only come to strengthen Chardin's sense of religious conviction, serving as a stretcher bearer for the 8th Moroccan Rifles of the French colonial army. Chardin would describe his experience in the war as a, quote, meeting with the absolute, end quote. In this statement, we can see an indication of Chardin's sense of religiosity, one colored by the metaphysics and phenomenological theology of German idealism and French spiritualism. In 1923, Chardin would travel to China, where he would participate in geological and paleontological research which included the discovery of the now famous Peking man hominid fossils. Due to his continued interest in evolutionary and geological history, Chardin was forced by his superiors within the Jesuit order to resign from his position at the Catholic Institute of Paris. Among both scientists and his fellow Catholics, Chardin was an immensely controversial figure, and the Holy Office of Pope John XXIII even administered an official decree which derided Chardin's works as both erroneous and dangerous. Chardin was faced with burning questions from both realms of his life and career. On the one hand were the realities of violence, cruelty, suffering, and seemingly senseless, industrialized slaughter of his fellow human beings which he experienced during the First World War. On the other was the image of human natural history, which was increasingly coming into focus through the compounding of paleoanthropological evidence. Both dimensions of Chardin's life seem to demand an answer to the same underlying question. What meaning can be found in the great narrative of the human journey, of the coming to being of Homo sapiens, and of the unfathomably glacial processions of geological time which had slowly generated the conditions for human existence? How and why did we arrive at this peculiar moment of cosmic history, and to what end is this vast journey ultimately aimed? In his attempts to answer these questions, Chardin would compose his most significant work, The Phenomenon of Man. Though this work was written during the 1930s, due to the controversy surrounding Chardin and his ideas, the book would not be published until 1955, following his death. The Phenomenon of Man would subsequently be translated into English and forwarded by Chardin's longtime colleague, Julian Huxley, who was himself an immensely significant figure in the history of evolutionary thought. Julian Huxley and his brother, the groundbreaking novelist and philosopher Aldous Huxley, were the grandchildren of Thomas Henry Huxley, the biologist and anthropologist who had been dubbed Darwin's Bulldog due to his polemical defenses of Darwinian theory during the late 19th century. Julian, in many ways, followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, and became one of the most prominent figures in the development of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, a framework which would become the prevailing paradigm of evolutionary theory throughout the 20th century. In his foreword to The Phenomenon of Man, Huxley is unhesitant to remark his reservations about some of Chardin's ideas, at least with regard to the manner in which Chardin attempts to reconcile and synthesize his evolutionary narrative with his Christian theological doctrines. Nevertheless, even Huxley's own views regarding religiosity were much more nuanced than a blunt and simplistic atheism. In 1969, he wrote, quote, "Many people assert that this abandonment of the God hypothesis means the abandonment of all religion and all moral sanctions. This is simply not true. But it does mean once our relief at jettisoning an outdated piece of ideological furniture is over, that we must construct something to take its place." Though Chardin's philosophy is certainly not one which could be described as an abandonment of a God hypothesis, it is nonetheless the case that Chardin was seeking a solution to the problem which Huxley clearly saw. Chardin sought a way to reconcile the human sense of meaning, purpose, transcendence, and divinity with the complex realities which were being revealed by the advances of scientific naturalism. Chardin saw the empirical evidence afforded by paleoanthropology as itself indicative of something peculiar about the place of humankind in evolutionary history. And Huxley indicates within his foreword that he saw Chardin's insights here to be accurate. Chardin notes that with regards to most biological groups, we find a common pattern of divergence and diversification. Darwin's finches, for example, all shared a common ancestor, yet as these creatures spread out across the Galapagos Islands, separate groups began to diverge in their physiology, behavior, and ecological roles. Overall, this process of divergence is seen throughout evolutionary history. Yet with the journey of human evolution, we see instead what seems to be almost the exact opposite process at work. Rather than a fanning out of diversification, hominid evolution instead appears as a convergence upon a single form. Though many forms of hominids have existed within the roughly 4 to 6 million years which have elapsed since our divergence from the great apes, the progression of hominid evolution seems to have been a consistent motion towards the realization of the same possibility. Within almost every step of the hominid journey, we see increases in brain size and a concerted development of bipedal locomotion and other physiological characteristics, all of which predisposed us towards the eventual development of language, complex social organization, and tool usage. Hominid evolution, rather than resulting in a diverse array of unique and separate forms, instead has converged upon a singular form, which seems to be the realization of a possibility which lured hominid evolution forward from our most primordial origins and into the present condition of a singular extant hominid species. Though the coming to being of Homo sapiens may be the most significant development in the evolutionary journey of life on this planet, it is actually not the only example of such an evolutionary lure. One other example, which I see as illustrative of a very similar process, can be seen in the evolutionary tendency which zoologists refer to as carcinization. Carcinization refers to the apparent tendency of certain invertebrates from a diverse variety of evolutionary lineages to converge upon a crab-like form. Common characteristics among species which have undergone carcinization include drastically reduced abdomen size, the broadening and flattening of the cephalothorax, and a number of other oddly specific features such as sexual dimorphism, which seems to be specialized to accommodate a crab-like morphology. These distinct species do not share these common crab-like characteristics because they all share a common ancestor which possessed such features. Many of these crabs belong to evolutionary taxa which are not closely related, yet nevertheless we see here a convergence of numerous features within these distinct groups. It is commonly assumed that evolution is essentially a random process, which would imply that if we were to rewind the clock of natural history and replay the evolution of life on Earth, that we would be likely to see radically different outcomes if minor contingencies were able to result in massive alterations over time. Evolution is understood to be an algorithmic process, which essentially acts upon mutational dice rolls, and if the dice were rolled again, then the outcomes of evolutionary processes would come to be radically different. Yet with this process of carcinization, we see an indication that this assumption may be misplaced. Carcinization seems to indicate that crabness may be something more like a kind of archetypal form, one which many different forms of creatures come to be lured towards due to the effectiveness and versatility of this archetype. If we were to find life on another planet, assuming that life on this hypothetical planet is similar to life on Earth in certain fundamental aspects, such as being carbon-based and cellular, then we probably wouldn't be too surprised to find something resembling a crab, and we might even be able to make predictions about the behavior and internal physiology of such creatures based on what we know about crab-like creatures here on Earth. Crabness, then, could be regarded as a kind of structure of potentiality. Certain possible organic features seem to go hand in hand, independently of historical contingencies, and thus the crab archetype is something which we can see as realizing itself within distinct biological lineages and time periods. We see an even more dramatic example of such convergence in the phenomenon of eyes. Scientists believe that complex eyes have evolved more than 1,500 times throughout the course of evolution. Having eyes is a very good trick, and a huge variety of creatures have thus developed the same archetypal feature independently of one another. If we look for examples of such phenomena throughout nature, we find that such archetypal convergences appear to be the rule rather than the exception. The extinct family Amphicyonidae consisted of dog-like creatures which shared many physiological characteristics with bears. Though not directly related to modern bears, these creatures nevertheless evolved very similar features, presumably due to occupying a very similar ecological niche. Likewise, many distinct groups of creatures have, throughout evolutionary history, developed very shrew-like characteristics. We could say that the shrew archetype is a structure of potentiality which has been realized via many distinct evolutionary pathways by numerous biological lineages within distinct time periods and geographic habitats. Thus it appears that evolution is much less random than we might otherwise assume, as the landscape of potential forms which evolution might come to actualize is a landscape which has certain defined structural features, despite the immense diversity of forms contained within it. A number of distinct archetypes come to give shape to evolutionary developments, and evolutionary diversification might be seen as being a process by which pathways are carved out which allow for the realization of such archetypes. In looking at the history of hominid evolution, Chardin sees a similar process at work, yet one with much more profound implications for our overall understanding of evolutionary history itself. Chardin sees the entire course of evolutionary history as a process which seems to be aimed towards the eventual coming into being of Homo sapiens, or at least something very much like us, which would be an actualization of the same underlying archetype that is humankind. Once a pathway towards the actualization of this archetype came to be opened, our hominid ancestors seem to have made a very directional beeline towards such actualization. Within the phenomenon of man, Chardin sketches out the history of evolution, not just of the evolution of life on Earth, but the evolution of the cosmos as a whole, in such a way as to illustrate what he sees as an inherent teleological impulse directed towards the realization of biological life, complex multicellularity, centralized nervous systems, human existence, and ultimately a grand convergence upon what he terms the omega point. In Chardin's view, the evolution of the cosmos is not at all the random, purposeless meandering of inert, mechanical causation. Rather, the cosmos we inhabit is indeed driven towards a kind of attractor, or what Terence McKenna would describe as a transcendental object at the end of history, a potentiality which, as a sort of teleological gravity, pulls time itself towards its realization. In The Phenomenon of Man, Chardin begins his exploration by looking to the nature of pre-biological matter itself, the fundamental building blocks which comprise our cosmos. Chardin explains that even in its most rudimentary and pre-biological state, matter itself can be seen as expressing certain fundamental characteristics which lay a groundwork from which the journey of life might then spring forth. These are characteristics which might seem so universal and so obvious that we may not even notice them, yet these properties of matter are immensely significant within the context of the grand, creative, teleological advance which Chardin sees in cosmic evolution. Matter consists of basic elements which exhibit multiplicity as well as uniformity. There are innumerable electrons, photons, and hydrogen atoms which comprise our cosmos, yet each of these particular categories is itself entirely uniform. Every individual electron behaves exactly like every other electron, and every proton is identical to every other proton. This might not seem at first to be a very consequential observation, but it is rather easy to imagine that things might have been different. We can easily imagine a world comprised of particles which each behaved in unique ways without adhering to strict categories, a world in which every unique building block acted in accordance with its own unique properties. We could just as easily imagine a world which was comprised of only one entity, a singular particle which did not behave consistently at all, but rather which seemed to act in accordance with principles which changed dramatically from moment to moment. Yet the properties of matter which we do in fact observe within our world seem to be exactly the kinds of properties which would be necessary for the eventual development of life. This duality of uniformity and multiplicity seems to provide exactly the conditions which would be necessary for the fundamental entities of our world to be able to come together so as to develop novel forms of complexity through the integration of multiplicity. It's usually at this point that skeptics of such teleological narratives would point to the so-called anthropic principle. This principle is actually an argument which states that the properties of the cosmos must conform to whatever conditions are necessary for the emergence of complex life. If a cosmos were not characterized by such properties, then, so the argument goes, there would be no observers within such a universe which could take note of its properties. Yet we humans are certainly here and certainly able to consider the properties of the universe as they are. As such, the only real possibility is that we should find a universe which looks as though it were conditioned specifically for the emergence of complex life. There is much more to be said about this line of reasoning than what I can say here, but before moving forward, I would like to outline some reasons why I see this anthropic principle as an unsatisfactory and misleading explanation. To begin, the anthropic principle assumes that the only possible observers which could exist in any universe are observers like us, which evolved through the gradual complexification of consciousness through biological evolution. Yet we don't necessarily have reason to believe that that is the case. To illustrate why, let us look at a thought experiment known as the Boltzmann brain. Within the Boltzmann brain thought experiment, we are asked to imagine a universe which is infinite, or at least incomprehensibly vast, which is subject to quantum fluctuations and fluctuations of thermodynamic equilibrium. Most of this universe would consist of essentially nothing except for tiny, unnoticeable, and inconsequential fluctuations which rapidly decay back into the abyss of thermodynamic equilibrium from which they arose. Yet if we imagine this universe to be temporally infinite, or at least to exist over immensely vast timescales, then simply due to the nature of random chance, eventually a complex intelligence would spontaneously emerge from this abyss of random fluctuations. Such a Boltzmann brain would find itself within a truly meaningless universe, and such a mind would then reasonably conclude that it came into being for no reason, as it did indeed come into being due to fluctuations of genuinely meaningless noise. Now, it isn't terribly important here whether Boltzmann brains actually exist, or if such universes of purely random fluctuations are actually out there somewhere within some hypothetical multiverse. What is important, however, is that the Boltzmann brain thought experiment illustrates a crucial flaw in the anthropic principle argument. It is at the very least logically possible that we could have found ourselves to be Boltzmann brains, looking out at a cosmos comprised only of meaningless noise. There is nothing which bars that possibility, and yet the universe we do indeed find ourselves within is not one of such noise. Rather, what we find is a universe within which the most fundamental properties of reality seem to be pregnant with the possibility of complexification, and thus ultimately the actualization of complex cellular life. The anthropic principle argument also assumes the existence of a very particular kind of multiverse. Now, it may very well be the case that we exist within some kind of multiverse, and cosmologists have entertained many different forms of multiverse theories. Yet for the anthropic principle argument to actually work, we must assume that our universe is part of a very specific kind of multiverse. In order to explain the apparent latency of life within our own universe by invoking the anthropic principle, we must assume that our universe is one of innumerable universes, and that each of these separate universes are conditioned by fundamental principles that are essentially determined at random. Within such a vast multiverse, most universes would be entirely lifeless and inert, and most would consist of essentially nothing. Yet due to the random dice rolls which determine the fundamental laws of these individual universes, some of these universes would be bestowed the necessary preconditions for the eventual emergence of complex life. And yet there is no actual reason whatsoever to believe that such a multiverse actually exists. It could just as easily be the case that our universe is part of a multiverse in which every individual universe is determined by the exact same fundamental principles. Likewise, it could also very well be the case that our own universe is the only universe that actually exists. And of course, the only universe we actually have any evidence of is our own universe. In either case, the anthropic principle fails to account for that which actually stands in need of explanation: the actual universe we actually find ourselves within, and the properties which we find it to have. Teilhard De Chardin saw this latent capacity for complexification as indicative of a much greater purposiveness, which he saw as conditioning the procession of cosmic and biological evolution at large. For Chardin, it is not simply that our universe seems to be directed towards a kind of ultimate goal, but rather that our universe is in fact directed towards such an aim. This ultimate telos, or omega point, is found within the grand scope of cosmic evolution, and also in the very bedrock principles which govern the nature of our reality at the most fundamental levels. Moving on to examine the nature of biological life itself, Chardin sees a clear continuation of this tendency. Expanding upon the more basic pre-biological processes of matter, biological life proceeds in accordance with a number of certain modalities, which give shape to life and its evolution throughout time. Along with self-organization, growth, reproduction, and incremental innovation, life also exhibits a kind of fundamental eros, by which life comes to synthesize the diversities it has produced so as to amplify and expand its own possibilities. Chardin describes this inner eros in terms of conjugation and association. In the former case, we have the processes of sexual reproduction, by which life is able to blend with itself so as to produce ever more forms of novelty, and thus by which new pathways of potentiality are opened to the progression of evolution. In the latter case, we have the propensity of life for coalescing into unities which transcend their individual constituents. Mere groupings become coordinated colonies, and such colonies come to be multicellular organizations of specialized classes of cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. This eros is what the philosopher of biology Donna Haraway would describe as sympoiesis. Elaborating upon Francisco Valera's notion of autopoiesis, or self-creation, Haraway understands sympoiesis to be a kind of self-creation and other creation through processes of mutualistic, participatory entanglements, associations, conjugations, and interweavings. Life is a process of becoming, and this becoming is a process of continual metamorphosis through ecological and metabolic enfolding. It is through this sympoietic eros that, as Alfred North Whitehead would say, the many become one and are increased by one. As Chardin sees it, these features of life are not in any way accidental or contingent, but are rather fundamental to the nature of life itself, and thus fundamental to their conditioning of the trajectory of life towards the realization of the structures of possibility which are latent within the very nature of the cosmos which we inhabit. Moving forward through the history of evolution, Chardin then brings our attention to the process of cephalization. Organisms begin to develop complex nervous systems and behavioral patterns, and we then begin to see the tendency of life to organize its nervous structures in such a way as to give rise to a centralized nexus of sensory and cognitive processes. We see the emergence of the brain. Over the course of hundreds of millions of years, we see a number of other pivotal developments. Vertebrae and skeletal structures allow creatures to develop larger brains and greater overall size upon land. The development of mammary glands, internal gestation, and eventually the placenta allow for organisms to prolong the development of offspring, thus allowing for greater cognitive plasticity. Organisms which must fend for themselves as soon as they are born must behave in instinctual ways which are strictly determined by what has proven effective in the past. Conversely, organisms which are afforded longer periods of development and infantile care have more time during which brains can develop, and in which those brains can come to learn more complex behavioral patterns which could not have been strictly encoded by heredity alone. Chardin sees the tree of life not as a random walk of probabilistic contingencies, but rather as a feeling forward of life towards the realization of its own innate potentials. As we look at the fanning of the tree of life over geological time, we see that many creatures come and go, with the vast majority of particular species coming to be extinct over the course of evolutionary development. Yet we also see that new developments of cognitive complexity are never relegated to the sands of time. Upon each step of this procession of cephalization and cognitive complexification, novel developments are continually retained and subsequently built upon by evolution. Certain forms come to be entrenched, particularly within certain groupings of related ecological niches. Jellyfish of the phyla Ctenophora and Cnidaria, for example, have scarcely changed at all over the course of the over 500 million years in which they have existed on our planet. Yet with each evolutionary epoch, we see a branching out of life's diversity in which innovations of complexity and cognition are retained, while forms which are relevant only to very specific ecological conditions more often become extinct as the conditions of Earth's biosphere come to mutate over geological time frames. This gradual process has, within the past few million years, resulted in the emergence of humankind, a process which Chardin refers to as hominization. Although the journey of life is certainly not yet complete, we do have some reason to believe that in terms of neurophysiological development, human beings may indeed be a kind of final, ultimate achievement. Having even larger brains is unlikely to increase our intelligence, as there are diminishing returns to increases in brain size, and there are reasons to believe that the current size of the human brain is very close to that threshold of diminishing returns in cognitive capability. Yet Chardin sees the emergence of humanity and the development of human civilization as being merely the beginning of yet another process, one which is currently well underway and which is planetary in proportion. As human beings have come to expand across the globe and have proceeded from mechanical technologies towards the emergence of information technologies, we see the beginnings of what Chardin dubs noogenesis, the emergence from the Earth's biosphere of the noosphere. Although he wrote more than half a century before the advent of personal computers or the internet, Chardin predicted that the continuing development of human consciousness would come to result in a kind of planetary nervous system, by which human consciousness would come to enfold upon itself, just as cellular life had once enfolded so as to give rise to multicellularity. What Chardin envisioned was the gradual development of a kind of planetary consciousness, which would allow the Earth to continuously and consciously direct its own regulation and its own future. Chardin's vision is not one of ultimate homogenization, a future in which humanity comes to be dissolved into a singular titanic totality within which all uniqueness, personality, and diversity are melded together. Rather, he sees a future in which the great swath of diversities created by the human journey coalesce so as to complete one another. For Chardin, the now emerging noosphere will be an achievement of synthesis and integration, not of homogenization and standardization. Our current situation within the histories of the cosmos, of life, and of human consciousness is of pivotal significance for two reasons. On the one hand, it is only very recently that human consciousness has come to an awareness of the nature of time itself. Not time as a cyclical reiteration of the past, nor as a mere mechanical falling of causal dominoes, but rather as a spiral, as a progression which feels its way forward into the realization of possibilities which magnetize the processes which comprise the world. This unfolding awareness of evolutionary time is thus a coming to awareness of the nature of consciousness itself as the self-consciousness of evolution itself. At every moment, each individual human consciousness steers itself through a space of possibilities towards certain actualizations, and this process itself is a hyper-accentuated and focused form of the general process by which cosmic evolution has brought us to our present state. On the other hand, we have the planetization of human consciousness. As human technological and economic powers have spread out and coalesced with one another as they have stretched out across the globe, so too have human culture and social organization come to merge so as to form a unified synthesis. As this grand ecological and cognitive synthesis continues to unfold in the biosphere, we will see the gradual synthesis of all life within an integrative, collective consciousness, which is more than the sum of its parts, yet in no way exhaustive of the diversities which come to be contained within it. Yet Chardin tells us that this coming to being of the noosphere is only the most imminent development of a process which is by no means complete, and one which is not only planetary, but also cosmic in scale. This is, of course, the omega point, the ultimate unification of all reality within a cosmic synthesis of consciousness. Although Chardin is quite reserved in his speculations about what might be in store for the deep future of life and humanity, he nevertheless contends that we can clearly see the overall curvature of the grand arc of cosmic history. As Chardin sees it, the cosmos as a whole is ultimately destined towards becoming encompassed within consciousness. For Chardin, this omega point is of theological as well as cosmological significance. Chardin argues that this ultimate encompassment within cosmic consciousness will be not only a grand harmonization, but also a grand redemption and sublimation of all that has occurred within the history of the cosmos, including human history. The omega point will come to encompass not only the entire cosmos within some distant future state, but will also come to encompass the past as well. As such, the omega point will result in an ultimate synthesis, not only of matter, but of all consciousness which has existed within the entire scope of cosmic history. Each and every unique personality which has come and gone within the history of our world will come to live within the indefinitely complexifying consciousness of the omega point. And thereby all of that which has been lost throughout the tumultuous and often violent history of the world will come to be renewed and redeemed. The omega point thus corresponds, in Chardin's view, to the spirit of Christ within Christian theology. It is the love which animates the cosmos and to which the cosmos is ultimately aimed. It is the ultimate purpose of the cosmos, its logos, telos, and eidos, through which all loss, agony, and suffering are ultimately sublimated and thus redeemed. In Aristotelian terms, we could say that the omega point is the final telos of cosmogenesis itself. Before bringing this discussion to a close, I would like to raise some objections and qualifications of Chardin's cosmology from my own perspective. I see Chardin's ideas as immensely significant, though there are certain regards in which I see his conception of the cosmos as incomplete. Chardin's cosmic teleology is one which is, as we have seen, directed inexorably towards a state of ultimate synthesis and harmonization. But this framework seems to me to beg a very important question. If the cosmos is drawn ultimately towards such a state of synthesis, why do diversity, dissonance, multiplicity, and chaos even exist at all? Modern astrophysical cosmology, as well as many theological forms of cosmology, seem to indicate that the cosmos began from a state of ultimate unity. The universe is said to have sprung forth from a unitary singularity, a state of undifferentiated oneness or pure potentiality. Why then did the cosmos not then simply remain in such a state of singular harmony indefinitely? Why didn't Brahman simply remain only Brahman? Why did the Elohim feel the need to stir the face of the deep rather than remaining in the state of pure oneness from which all things came to be? It seems to me that there is something missing within Chardin's analysis. He sees the cosmic telos as being synthesis within consciousness, and he sees this synthesis as a unification of multiplicity rather than a dissolution within homogeneity, but he does not account for how such multiplicity might arise to begin with. Chaos itself seems to be simply a given for Chardin, and it seems to me that this in itself is an oversight. If we conceptualize the ultimate aim of the cosmos not as unity in itself, but rather as the harmonization of difference, then we can see that the ultimate cosmic telos actually consists of a polarity of distinct aspects. We have on the one hand the impulse towards difference and the perpetuation of difference. Out of this archetypal impulse emerges chaos, separation, and dissonance, but also uniqueness, individuality, diversity, and contrast. On the other hand, we have the impulse towards the synthesis or harmonization of such differences. The many become one and are increased by one, and thereby the multiplicities generated by the cosmos come to be unified in ever more grand and complex forms of unification. The cosmic omega, then, is, in my view, a polarity of consonance and dissonance, light as well as darkness, as the ultimate aim of cosmic evolution is not merely unification, but rather it is the drive towards intensity of beauty, experience, consciousness, and numinosity. This drive towards intensity itself implies and necessitates contrast, difference, chaos, darkness, and indeed pain, anxiety, and destruction. Chardin's cosmology also seems to imply that the omega point is in fact an ultimate future state in which all things come to coalesce within the unity of consciousness on a cosmic scale. This too seems to be at odds with what is indicated by modern astrophysics. Although our current understanding of the physical nature, history, and future of the cosmos is far from complete, what contemporary astrophysics seems to indicate is that on the largest of temporal scales, the universe is not in fact destined towards an ultimate coalescence, but rather towards an ultimate dissolution back into the quantum void from which it emerged. The physical universe is expanding, and this rate of expansion is increasing. Further, the assumptions about the nature of matter and energy which currently hold sway within physics indicate that the overall entropy of the universe is destined to increase over the course of cosmic timescales. This is to say that the amount of difference in energy distribution within the cosmos will come to decrease over the course of vast timescales, possibly leading to an ultimate breakdown and dissolution of matter, and eventually of space-time itself. These facts would seem to contradict Chardin's overall cosmology, in which Chardin foresaw the universe as ultimately destined towards a coalescence of all things into a singular, immanent form of consciousness. It would seem that the lure of Chardin's omega point may indeed result in the evolution, involution, and enfolding of consciousness in a localized manner, such as within the history of the Earth and humanity, but that this lure may be unable to achieve the grand synthesis which Chardin envisioned to occur at a cosmic scale. But I think that we can see a potential resolution to these discrepancies if we turn to the work of Alfred North Whitehead, another significant pioneer within the tradition of process philosophy and a contemporary of Chardin. Although a truly rigorous comparison of Whitehead with Chardin is far beyond the scope of this video, I think that briefly contrasting Chardin's cosmology with that of Whitehead will be very illustrative of how the two thinkers might complement one another. Within Whitehead's process relational cosmology, we see a cosmos which is not necessarily aimed towards a singular grand unification to be achieved at some point in the distant future. Rather, we see a cosmos which, due to its most fundamental nature, is continually achieving a kind of ultimate synthesis with each and every moment. According to Whitehead, there is no need for the past to be redeemed in some definite future state of unity, as every moment of consciousness comes to be incorporated into a cosmic totality as it perishes into the past. The past, therefore, is, for Whitehead, a continually expanding totality of cosmic consciousness in which all things are immortalized, and thereby sublimated into the whole of the cosmos. The cosmic redemption which Chardin envisioned would therefore be something which is being continually realized, rather than waiting to be fulfilled by some distant future state of the universe. As such, we could say that even if the universe as a whole is destined towards a final dissolution due to the inexorable procession of entropy and cosmic expansion, the cosmos can nonetheless be seen to be driven by an all-encompassing telos, just as Chardin describes. The omega is very much operative in driving the grand process of cosmogenesis, but it is a kind of transcendental love, which is comprised of both light and darkness, and which comes to be continually actualized within the whole of cosmic evolution, and thus within every moment of human existence. However we might interpret the ideas found within Chardin's work, it is nevertheless abundantly clear to me that his thought is uniquely significant. He was a thinker who was immensely ambitious in his attempts to understand the universe, as he sought to account not only for the actualities of the natural world and natural history, but also for the meaning of human existence within such a natural world. His thought is naturalistic, yet also cosmological, metaphysical, and theological. In thinking with Chardin, we face ourselves against truly ultimate questions pertaining to the nature of life, consciousness, the struggles of human existence, and finally the nature of reality itself. And that's going to be it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Of course, I very much appreciate everyone who has done so already. I've got a lot of cool projects that I have planned for this channel, and I'll be continuing to upload each and every week for as long as that is feasible. So I hope you guys stick around for that. And with all that said, once again, thanks for watching.